How's it going, class? So this is going to be the first of the two lectures that I said I was going to be posting for you all, since I will be taking an interview during our class time next week. Just got done with an interview right now, hence why I am dressed like a waiter. But next lecture I'll be posting just after this. So I'll try to keep them as quick as possible. I know listening to lectures online is relatively boring, so I don't really want you sitting there boring listening to me online, as opposed to being bored sitting there in person. So I'll try to get through this lecture as quick as I can. I'm going to share my screen with you here quick. And I'm just going to leave it like that. All right. So today we're going to be talking about training for aerobic endurance, remembering a brief review of aerobic glycolysis, right? Remembering that the Krebs cycle is giving us two important things. The first thing is just a little bit of ATP, and then the high energy electron carriers that's giving us. So these NADHs and FADH2, those are going to move into the electron transport chain, pump the hydrogens up here into the intramembrane space, which is going to allow hydrogens to flow down through the ATP synthase, causing that mechanical crank, which is then going to give us the ATP, right? So the first important thing of this is blood to the muscles. So oxygenated blood is transported via the arteries. This should all be reviewed. Oxygen fuses across the capillaries into the muscle, use the electron transport chain, internal respiration, right? CO2 is moved from the muscle into the capillary, where it's then transported back to the heart and back to the pulmonary circuit in the lungs via the veins, right? So remember we talked about oxygen delivery improves with training, and for a variety of different means, or by a variety of different means. First one, cardiac output. If we have more blood flowing throughout the body, that means that we likely have more ability to transport oxygen and remove carbon dioxide and those negative metabolites, and therefore improving aerobic performance. There's also going to be increased AVO2 difference, right? So the idea with AVO2 difference is just a measurement of the difference in the amount of oxygen from the arterial side to the venous side. And what we talked about before, what's the reason why there's a higher AVO2 difference? Why is there a bigger difference between the arterial side and the venous side? Well, because the muscles are extracting more oxygen. And why would they be extracting more oxygen? Well, because they're utilizing more oxygen. Remember, the muscles aren't just going to take in more oxygen for no reason. This is happening through simple diffusion. And so if more oxygen is moving into the tissue, that means that more oxygen is being utilized in the tissue by the mitochondria, right? And more oxygen is being utilized by the mitochondria because either there is more mitochondria, they are larger, or they are more efficient at utilizing that oxygen. And then on the same basic scale, higher blood volume. As you go through aerobic training, you increase blood volume, similar to what it is with cardiac output. If we just have more blood in the body, we have more of an ability to transport oxygen. Remember that our rate limiting step for aerobic respiration, or for utilization of oxygen in the body, is the actual transport of the oxygen itself from the lungs to the tissue. And so if we have more blood, we have more capability, more ability to transport that oxygen. So we talk about aerobic capacity. One of the key terms that you need to understand that we talked about before is VO2 max. So VO2 max broken up, volume of oxygen maximum. This is the maximal amount of oxygen that your body can utilize or consume during any given amount. So typically it's done in the idea of milliliters of oxygen per kilogram per minute. Sorry. So down here we see a couple of different measurements. So we see our absolute amount, which is the liters per minute, or we see a relative amount, which is oxygen per kilogram per minute. And the relative amount is realistically, like we talked about before, the best way you want to go about measuring VO2 max in terms of aerobic capacity, because absolute is really just defined by the size of the body. Will it get better with aerobic training? Absolutely. But like the analogy that I like to use, or I've used before, is that Shaquille O'Neal, of course, is going to have an extremely high, Shaq is going to have an extremely high absolute VO2 max because he's really, really big. So he's going to consume lots of oxygen because he has lots of metabolic tissue. Now, if I were to compare him to, say, an Olympic marathon runner, again, he's probably going to have a higher VO2 max in the absolute manner in liters per minute, just because he's so much larger in general. But realistically, the marathon runner is going to have a much higher relative VO2 max because their individual cells, if we compare their individual cells to the Shaq's individual cells, the marathon runner, whoever that may be, is going to be much more efficient at utilizing oxygen within those cells, and therefore will have a much higher relative VO2 max because it's based on their actual weight here, right? So when we talk about aerobic performance, remember, we keep in mind that there's a variety of different factors, okay? So when it comes to aerobic performance, We obviously have our psychological factors, your motivation, pain tolerance, your aptitude for running, the environment, things like that. Then we have our physiological factors, VO2 max, body temperature, blood glucose, hydration status, fat oxidation, all these different things. And then finally, biomechanical factors. And this is going to play a little bit more into the idea of running economy. But also remember that there are biomechanical factors just in the fact of how is your body shaped? How long are your appendages? How much do you weigh? All these things play into aerobic performance, are important for aerobic performance. And that's why you see pretty much all Olympic athletes or high echelon athletes look relatively the same, because there is a very specific body type that is best for aerobic performance. So the things that we know about heart rate response to exercise. So heart rate response, heart rate increases relatively linearly as exercise intensity increases. So as you increase the intensity of exercise, so too does your heart rate in a linear fashion. So if your exercise intensity increases by 20%, relatively, your heart rate will likely increase by 20% relatively, right? So heart rate response is altered with training. So what we see here is if we have an individual who's unfit versus someone who's fit, we have a different heart rate response. It increases a little bit more gradually over time and hits a lower plateau at steady state, whatever state this running is. So let's say they're running at, per se, 10 miles an hour. And then they're going to return to baseline much, much more rapidly. And if we remember, the reason that heart rate is allowed to be lower or can be lower at any given pace is because stroke volume is much higher and therefore more efficient. Remember, our heart has an aptitude, or our body has an aptitude at making sure each contraction is more efficient, because when the heart contracts, it actually constricts its own blood flow. So when the heart is in a contracted state, it actually cannot get blood flow to itself. And so the more time the heart can spend between contractions, i.e. the less contractions it has per minute, the more capable the heart is of perfusing itself with blood. And that makes it more efficient. If the heart is beating at 170 times per minute, there's very, very little amount of time for blood to actually get back into the tissue. And as you can imagine, if the heart is beating really rapidly, but also getting less blood to itself, it's going to become rapidly inefficient and at times can even become damaging to the heart in very extreme circumstances. So the heart, through aerobic training, has an interest in making each contraction more efficient so that it has more time in between each contraction to make the perfusion of blood back into the tissue more effective. Yeah, I think that's all I want to talk about there, right? And then also we talk about our blood flow response to exercise. So I've talked about this before, but the idea of shunting blood flow to the muscles during exercise. Blood flow is going to go where blood flow is needed. So if there is a need for oxygen transport in, let's say, the quadriceps, there's going to be a shunting and an increase of blood flow to that area, hence the pump and the edema that you see when you utilize muscles during exercises and resistance training, right? We've all done leg days, or more commonly probably chest days or arm days, whatever. You see a nice pump, a nice pump in your biceps or your triceps or your chest or whatever that may be. That is quite literally because there is more blood flow in the area and therefore more edema and more fluid in the tissues. But to do that, we can't just create blood willy-nilly out of nowhere. We need to shunt blood away from other areas. So what we typically do is we will shunt blood flow away from predominantly like the GI tract, the kidneys, and other portions of the body. As you can see here, it makes sense as exercise intensity increases, heart rate distribution or heart blood flow distribution increases because the heart's working harder. It's doing more pumps, it's pumping more vigorously, it has more contractility, some more forceful contraction. So it's going to need more oxygen. Obviously, the skeletal muscle that we're using is going to need more oxygen. The brain, however, is going to stay relatively the same. The whole mantra of the body and the whole goal of the body is to keep the brain in a very homogeneous environment. Keep it in equilibrium. No matter what you're doing, what the body tries to do is to keep the environment surrounding the brain very, very consistent. That's why in instances, let's say, where you are waking up in the morning and you're doing fasted exercise, sometimes individuals will get lightheaded. I've had it happen to me before, where I got lightheaded, I got nauseous, I laid down. What was happening is that my blood glucose was dropping to such a significant low amount that it was now affecting blood glucose for my brain's utilization. So now blood glucose is not readily available for the brain. The brain's going to respond by going, all right, we need to stop exercising. We're going to lay down so that we're no longer utilizing blood glucose in the tissue so that I, the brain, can get that blood glucose back to myself. Hence why you lay down, hence why you get nauseous, because that's your response to prevent you from continually exercising so that we can maintain homeostasis in the brain. That's how strong the brain is, as you can imagine, at controlling the rest of the body, because that's its whole function, right? We see blood flow shunted to the skin. And as we talked about before, the blood flow is shunted to the skin. Why? It's shunted to the skin so that you can get rid of some of your internal body temperature. As your cells work, they build up heat as in the non-efficient process of ATP production. One of the byproducts is heat. And so to get rid of that heat, we shunt that blood flow to the skin so that it can radiate off, or it can be lost through convection or whatever heat loss mechanism, so that we can then lower our core body temperature and keep us in the proper range for function. With that is the idea of cardiac drift, right? So with the increased demand for blood, right, where's the blood going to go? We want it to go to the skin, we want it to go to the muscle, we got to keep going to the brain, right? And what's going to happen over time as we're losing blood volume, i.e. sweating, is we're going to see something called cardiac drift. And what this really is a gradual decrease in the efficiency of the cardiovascular system. So as blood volume begins to decrease, right, we're going to see a decrease in cardiac output. We're going to see a decrease in skin blood flow, a decrease in stroke volume. And therefore, to make up for that, we're going to see an increase in heart rate and an increase in total peripheral resistance. And as you can imagine, you look at all these things and you're like, well, all increased blood volume was good, increased cardiac output was good, increased stroke volume was good. Those are all things that are good adaptations to aerobic training. But in cardiac drift, we see them start to become decreased. And obviously, this is not good for our performance. And you're going to see a rapid or an exponential decrease in performance as these things decline over time. What can you do to make sure you don't go through cardiac drift? Easiest and simplest thing is make sure that you maintain hydration, but then also make sure that you maintain a relatively constant body temperature. Obviously, you're going to increase as you begin exercising, but if you can get some cooling in there, if you can work out in a maintained temperature-controlled environment, it's all going to help prevent this phenomena of cardiac drift. So physiological responses to acute endurance exercise. I'm not going to go over all these here. You guys can read. The general idea is pretty much exactly what I have been talking about thus far as we go through it, right? And then the idea here, pretty much the same thing. I'm not going to go over this. Like I said, I'm going to try to go through this lecture as fast as possible. But the idea is that your adaptations are essentially making your body more efficient at transporting oxygen to the tissue, and the tissue itself is thus becoming more efficient at utilizing that oxygen, right? So we see stroke volume is a general graph here showing the stroke volume, milliliters per beat in trained versus untrained individuals, pre-training versus post-training, right? Essentially, the idea here is that we are getting a greater ejection volume per contraction, which is leading to a greater amount of fluid ejected per beat, obviously, which is leading to a great amount of fluid ejected per minute. And how is this occurring? Well, just like all other muscles in the body, your heart is going through hypertrophy. So we look at these elite marathon runners, right, or a Tour de France cyclist, we can see a much larger left ventricle. Remember, the left ventricle is responsible for pumping blood throughout the body. When it's used more, it's going to grow. It's going to go through hypertrophy. It's a muscle. That's how it works, right? So we can get a greater stroke volume because quite literally the muscle that is responsible for ejecting that blood gets stronger and it gets better at its job. And with that, we see this increased heart rates, increased cardiac output over this time as well. So with a training period, you're going to see increased cardiac output. A lot of review here for you guys. As I said, if you guys understood the content in the first portion of the class, you're really going to understand the second portion of the class. I don't love the second portion of the class because I feel like it's a lot of reiteration. And it makes no sense for me to teach you the first part of the class without keying in on some of the things that we're talking about the second part. But I'm not the one that gets to make the decision on the textbook. So here we are. I get to teach the class, but not choose a textbook, which is, a discussion that I will skip over for now. Right, and then also talking about heart rate adaptation, all these things, right? Heart rate adaptation is going to be lower after a training period. And more importantly, something that can also show an elevated level of aerobic fitness is this idea of a faster return to baseline in trained individuals. So we see post-training here, right? they're going to have lower heart rate overall, but also they're going to return to baseline. And what that realistically means is that we talk about the idea of EPOC, or excessive post-exercise oxygen consumption, the idea that you are maintaining an elevated level of oxygen consumption after exercise because you need that oxygen consumption to recover and return to baseline. But what a gradually or a more rapid return to baseline of your heart rate is telling you is that your body is actually much better at returning to baseline. The only reason that your body and your heart rate is allowed or can actually go back to baseline faster after training is because there is no longer that stimulus around the body for as long to return to normal. So because you can return to normal, because your tissue is individually responsible, and because all the mechanisms that are involved in aerobic exercise become more efficient at returning to normal, this allows your heart rate to also return to normal more rapidly. Just showing some difference in stroke volume for our endurance sedentary or sedentary after training, right? Again, pretty much the same idea of what we're talking about. This is also very much review. Oxygen needs as intensity increases, so too does AT demand. In response, the rate of oxidative ATP production increases, O2 intake in our lungs increases. And remember, the O2 intake in our lungs is just increasing relatively. We are breathing more rapidly, and there are more cells that are more capable, or excuse me, the cells now are loading off more CO2, and therefore they're taking on more O2. But the diffusion fraction really isn't changing, right? So the oxygen isn't diffusing faster across the alveoli. There's just more red blood cells going through the lungs now because their cardiac output is higher. And those red blood cells were previously holding more carbon dioxide, so now they're picking up more oxygen, which is what makes the O2 intake in the lungs go up, right? And then O2 delivered to the muscles is higher. We have a higher cardiac output, right? And after training, we have more red blood cells, we have more blood volume, and therefore our transport of oxygen to the tissue is much, much more efficient. Now, because the transport of the oxygen is more efficient, and because there is more utilization of the oxygen in the cells, we're going to see an increase in VO2 max, the maximal ability of the body to utilize or consume oxygen, right? And remember, again, the rate limiting step is the transport of that blood and that oxygen to the cells. And so if that process is getting more efficient, so too does our availability to consume oxygen. Just as a reference, if you're an individual that have done a VO2 max, I know that there's field-based VO2 max tests that aren't the most accurate, but you can do it if you want to see your VO2 max. Or if you're in one of the assessments labs, you can sign up during one of our labs to do a VO2 max test. Here's a general VO2 max scale. So for our age group, for us males, right, typically you would like to see a VO2 max that's somewhere above 44 or at least in the 40s. Right, so anaerobic versus aerobic principles. So do we think that anaerobic fitness can affect aerobic performance? So we talked about this a little bit before. Oh, excuse me, when I talked about high intensity interval training. I give you guys kind of time to think about here. So just think to yourselves. I know that we're not in class, and I know that there's no call and response here, but I'll let you think in your own mind and then kind of move on here. Right, so again, jumping back into anaerobic glycolysis. Remember that glycolysis or aerobic glycolysis must begin with anaerobic glycolysis. And anaerobic glycolysis is specifically really good for producing ATP in a moderate duration at a moderate intensity. Breaks down glucose from the blood, right? Does not require oxygen, right? But the downside of anaerobic glycolysis is that it does produce acidosis, which is detrimental to exercise, which is why we don't continually use this process. It does provide us with relatively robust and quick energy, but it also provides us with a very negative detriment, i.e. the buildup of hydrogen ions, which slow down our exercise. Now, that being said, being in on that buildup of acidosis comes into the idea of the lactate threshold. Remember, it's called the lactate threshold because lactate also accumulates in a relatively consistent manner with acidosis. And the only reason we call it lactate threshold is because that's what we measured first. But remember, lactate is not the issue here. Like I talked about before the exam, there's going to be a fair amount of you on the exam. They're still going to think lactate is the issue. And on that question, I think I still had like 17% of students in the class respond thinking that lactate was the issue. Yes, it accumulates at the same time, but remember, lactate functions as a buffer and it can be utilized as fuel. It is not the reason that we are feeling fatigue and does not have any mechanism that is causing fatigue. The buildup of the hydrogen ions is what is causing fatigue. But keeping in mind, remember that lactate threshold is a threshold at which acidosis begins to overwhelm our buffering capabilities. So it begins to essentially overflow. Talked before about the Brita water filter, how if you turn the faucet, let's say half full, it's pouring into the top portion of that Brita water filter, it can drain the water fast enough so that the water coming from the faucet doesn't overflow the Brita water filter. But if you turn the faucet on all the way, we get a really rapid dispense of water into the top of the Brita water filter, it's going to begin to overflow. And once it begins to overflow, it's going to flow out into the sink or wherever it might be. Same thing with the idea of the acidosis. We have a certain rate at which we can remove, buffer, and handle the acidosis. But once it begins to overflow, right, the rate at which we can handle it doesn't change, so it begins to spread and becomes rampant, and it diminishes our ability to go through muscular contraction, a variety of different ways that we talked about before. But in this capacity, you're going to see a detriment in performance. So we looked at our lactate threshold, right? A trained individual is going to reach lactate threshold later, so at a later percentage of their VO2 max or at a higher treadmill speed. And this is really important for aerobic performance. Marathon runners spend a lot of time finding where their lactate threshold is, because if you notice, if you see here, no matter how well trained you are, what do you notice about these two increased lines for lactate or, excuse me, acidosis buildup? What you should be noticing here is that they're relatively parallel. And what that's telling you is that no matter what shape you are in, once you reach lactate threshold, the buildup of your negative metabolic byproducts, in this case, pretty much predominantly hydrogen, occurs at the same rate no matter your training. So what marathon runners will do is they will get a lot of running practice and a lot of metabolic testing to find out what speed their lactate threshold is predominantly at. Again, I know that there's multiple lactate thresholds. We have OBLA, L1, L2. Some people even call about OBLA 2, right? Depending on how you want to look at it, we're going to keep it very simple for the purpose of this class. But the idea still remains is if a runner can figure out, hey, my lactate threshold occurs at 11.6 miles per hour. That means it's in my best interest to maintain a race pace at like 11.5 miles per hour so that I don't go over that threshold and don't begin to rapidly accumulate acidosis and hydrogen ions, right? Because no matter how well trained you are, the accumulation rate is going to be relatively the same once you go over the threshold. So they have a lot of interest in staying below that threshold, right? And so what can you do? Why is high intensity interval training so good? Well, when you run, let's say, a 5 mile or a 5K or a 10K, you are running at much below your lactate threshold for much of the race. You just naturally are likely going to run at that. If you're somebody who runs 10Ks a lot, your race pace is going to be much, much lower than your lactate threshold, right? So you don't spend a lot of time above lactate threshold, likely not until the very end of the race. So therefore, you don't spend a lot of time stressing the system that removes acidosis. And so the benefit of high intensity interval training is, let's say at the end of a 10K, you spend the last minutes above lactate threshold. When you do a high intensity interval training, let's say you do like 15 seconds on or 30 seconds off, let's say 30 seconds on, minute off, 30 seconds on, minute off, 30 seconds on, minute off, and you do 10 rounds of that, right? Now you have spent 10 30-second increments above your lactate threshold, which leads to 5 minutes above your lactate threshold, and therefore 5 minutes in which you are stressing your body's ability to handle that acidosis and handle that negative metabolic byproducts. And so what's it going to do? Well, as we see here in our training, it's going to begin to eventually slowly shift. You're getting better at handling the acidosis, getting better at utilizing that lactate. So that lactate threshold begins to shift, and therefore, as it shifts to a higher running speed, so too can your race pace that you can maintain just below lactate threshold. So I hope that makes sense. But the general idea is with high intensity interval training, you can specifically train your lactate threshold so that during your aerobic performances, your lactate threshold is thus higher, and thus the pace that you can maintain that's just below the lactate threshold is thus higher. So that race pace during, let's say, a 10K is faster, and therefore you'll finish the race more quickly. We'll skip over this for now. One thing we'll talk about is running economy, right? So while VO2 max is the single best measurement of aerobic performance in almost all individuals, it is not the best predictor of endurance performance in elite individuals, right? So VO2 max for almost all the population, if I were to line all of you up, have you do a VO2 max test, I could then line you all up, say, okay, you had 41, or you had 31, you had 32, you had 33, you had 34, you had 35, whatever it might be, right? And I can say, okay, this is the scale. You had the highest at 58. So most likely, you can come in. Most likely at 58, you are going to be the fastest runner of a race. So if I took you all, I said, okay, go run a mile and a half. You can run that mile and a half, and most likely whoever has the highest VO2 max will finish first. Whoever has the second highest VO2 max will finish second, and so on and so forth. It probably won't be perfect because there's going to be people that practice running and people that don't practicing running. But in general, in the average population, it'll generally align in that manner. However, in elite individuals, because everyone is already at their ceiling for VO2 max, the actual most important indice is going to be running economy. And running economy is just like gas economy. How much energy does it take for you to get a certain distance? So let's say I have a car and this car drives and it gets me 20 miles per gallon. And I have another car and that car drives and it gets me 30 miles per gallon. In the first car, it takes me 1 gallon of gas worth of energy. However much energy, potential energy is stored in the chemical bonds of that gas. It takes 1 gallon of gas to go 20 miles, right? Now, on the other car, it takes 1 gallon of gas to go 30 miles. So if we compare them now, we're going to drive 60 miles. Car number 1 requires 3 gallons of gas to go 60 miles. Car number 2 only requires 2 gallons of gas to go 60 miles. And so you can look at that and go, obviously car number 2 is more economical. It's the same idea in the body, right? So if you are more economical, you can do the same amount of work, a 60-mile race, 60 miles the car versus like, let's say a 6-mile race the individual. An individual who can use less energy to do the same amount of work or maintain the same pace is going to be more economical, right? Because when you are running in a long distance race, you are not running at your VO2 max, right? You're not running 100% VO2 max. You would be exhausted relatively rapidly. You are running below that. And so because everyone has such a high VO2 max, it becomes somewhat negligible in these elite populations. And what really becomes more important is how much energy does it take you to move from point A to point B, or how much energy does it take you to run at the specific pace? And there's, like we talked about before, a few different factors, right? So one of the things that plays into is just the economy of the effort or the mechanical efficiency of your movement, right? We see a child running here, right? We realistically see them kind of bounding. They have a lot of arm motion. They have long strides. They're bouncing a lot versus on the bottom here, we see an individual who has very stable strides, very close arm structure, and what I like to call very quiet hips. The idea that their hips are not moving up and down. We see this person's hips or this child's hips sway back and forth, and then we see them bounce a lot. This individual's hips are relatively locked into with their stride, and they are staying relatively linear or a same distance from the ground, which means there's almost no wasted motion. So the idea being is because there's no wasted motion or almost no wasted motion, they are not going to be wasting energy on that wasted motion, and therefore they will be more economical, right? So we look at this, right? We see oxygen uptake at any given speed. And again, this is a little bit confusing, but the idea here is we look at runner A and runner B. Runner B is requiring less oxygen uptake at this given speed. Again, keeping in mind that this is with elite individuals. So, but it really does transfer to everyone. If they can run at 14.5 kilometers per hour or 9 miles per hour, 14.5 kilometers per hour, 9 miles an hour, right? They can run at that same speed, but utilize less oxygen. Therefore, they are likely utilizing less ATP through aerobic glycolysis or out of the oxidative system. And therefore, they are likely more efficient to do the same race pace or do the same amount of work. It requires less oxygen from them, okay? So now we're gonna jump into a few other adaptations, right? Talking about muscular adaptations to aerobic training, right? What we're talking about here is just the difference predominantly in a VO2 difference. Remember we talked about how there's a shift or an increase in mitochondrial capacity, increase in mitochondrial efficiency, mitochondrial size, right? Which is causing this greater AVO2 difference. We're also going to see type 1 fibers shift and hypertrophy. Type 1 fibers don't really go through a lot of hypertrophy, right? We talked before about myofibril hypertrophy or sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. Realistically, all these type 1 fibers do is go through sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. They're getting better at storing glycogen. They're getting better at, they have a lot more mitochondria, and they're getting bigger in that way, but realistically, they're not really gaining in size a lot. Myoglobin, we haven't really talked about myoglobin, but we talked about hemoglobin. Hemoglobin, right? Globin is just a protein. Heme means blood, right? Myocytes, myo means muscles. This is just the globin that's in the muscle. So we haven't gone as deep into this, but part of the process of getting oxygen to the cells and getting oxygen to the mitochondria is there are actually globulin proteins in the muscle that are responsible for transporting oxygen from the diffusion coefficient at the capillary directly to the mitochondria. So I'm not going to test you too much on that, but the idea that myoglobin or the ability to transport oxygen now within the cell specifically is increasing. Capillary density, so we have angiogenesis occurring, which means more capillaries around the muscle tissue. More capillaries means more ways to distribute and deliver oxygen, which means more efficient oxygen delivery. And then I talked about the other two we have here. So with aerobic training, you'll see a slight shift of all these fibers, right? Mitochondria begins to build in these cells. It begins to replicate. And then we also get the angiogenesis, the increased capillary density, and all those things that are going to shift our fibers towards type 1 fibers, right? Right, so we talk about rate of glycogen depletion, right? So again, just kind of the idea here is that because we are getting more oxygen available to the cells, because the cells are more efficient at utilizing oxygen, that means they're likely going to be more efficient at utilizing glycogen. And they will burn through glycogen much more quickly, likely also because you're running faster during your pace, right? You running at 8 miles per hour 10 months ago versus you running at 8 miles per hour now, you're going to be more efficient, so you're not going to require as much oxygen, absolutely. But keep in mind, after 10 months of training, likely you're going to be running at a much, much faster pace. You probably have not hypertrophied a lot. You probably have not gotten a lot bigger. So you haven't gotten a lot more storage of intramuscular glycogen, but now you're running at a much, much faster pace. And therefore, you may be burning through your intramuscular glycogen much more quickly. And therefore, it's very, very important to have supplemented carbohydrates during prolonged exercise performance. You can increase that blood glucose, which allows you to spare intramuscular glycogen, or you use them in tandem together, which you can maintain your pace for a longer period of time. Keep in mind that this is usually for longer duration of performances, let's say like 1 hour, 2 hours, right? We don't see a massive amount of glycogen depletion before the half an hour mark. But once your exercise starts to get around 45 minutes to an hour or even 90 minutes, that's when you really, really should think about supplementing glycogen in your exercise. Essentially just a graph showing here what happens when you have a depletion group. This is a non-depletion group, right? Our non-depletion group is storing their muscle glycogen or using muscle glycogen in a much lower manner, right? So when you exercise, right, this is the time where you have the excuse to have those rapidly oxidizing carbohydrates, the sugars, so simple sugars. So that's why you see something like those bodybuilders that will eat Rice Krispies before their exercise, or they drink Gatorade during their exercise, or they have some sort of like jelly or something before their exercise or during their exercise. It provides a very, very fast, easy to break down sugars and carbohydrates, which you can utilize during exercise. And again, this seems counterintuitive to general health because you're like, well, they tell us to stay away from sugars. No, they're telling you to stay away from sugars during non-active periods, which is pretty much usually 22 to 23, if not 24 hours of your day. But in preparation for exercise or during high intensity exercise, where you're utilizing a lot of carbohydrates and you want to maintain a race pace or maintain a high level of intensity, supplementing with simple sugars during that time is a very effective way to make sure you can maintain that high intensity and therefore maintain a higher training stimulus. Talked about blood volume already, the increase in blood volume. You guys can look at that. There's no significant change in lung structure or function. Remember that there's not a lot of change in the lungs. The lungs are more than capable of just simply diffusing oxygen across the membranes into the blood. So there's really not a lot. The main difference being is that you can ventilate more. So your diaphragm is more efficient. Your lungs are more efficient at breathing, right? So you take longer breaths, larger breaths, and therefore you can see a greater amount of ventilation. But realistically, the lungs themselves are not changing a lot, just your ventilation and your breathing rate are changing, right? So kind of in summary here, to make a successful endurance athlete, right, we're going to key in first on VO2 max, right? And then when we talk about race pace, VO2 max is essentially kind of the maximal ability of the body to consume the oxygen, so your maximum capacity. You can think of lactate threshold as kind of your speed limit. So how fast can you run at, right? So VO2 max is the total distance that you can go, the total amount of work that you can do. Lactate threshold is kind of the speed limit at which you can run or drive. right? Economy of effort, again, is just the economy. So how much energy does it take you to do each of these activities? And these all kind of key on the muscular adaptation, right? Muscular adaptation is kind of leading to a change in all of these things. Almost done here. I know I've gone through it fast, but hopefully you guys prefer it to be fast rather than slow. We're going to talk about classical versus contemporary carbohydrate loading strategies. This is keys in a little bit of carbohydrate timing, which I'll talk about in the very last lecture of the year, right? But this is important for aerobic performance or high intensity performance. So the classical idea of carbohydrate loading is essentially what you see here. We have our event, right? And then we have our 6 days before our event, right? So you'll have 3 days of relatively low carbohydrate diet or normal carbohydrate diet. This is pretty low. But then you'll have the last 3 days be a relatively high amount. So 500 grams of carbohydrates. So for me, that would be about 5 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram, right? And that's going to make more sense in a second here. Sorry. This is about 5 grams of carbohydrates per kilogram. So relatively low. And then the 3 days leading up to that, what this does is it creates a stimulus for increased glycogen storage within the muscle. And therefore, because you have more glycogen storage within the muscle, you are going to have more glycogen available to you during your events. And therefore, you can likely perform better during your events. Now, this is a very classical model. This is very, very well utilized, and this is very efficient. And if you're an individual that has like weekend events, let's say like a football player, hockey player, whatever it might be, I can imagine most individuals at the high levels are going through some sort of classical model of carbohydrate loading, if they're not also just having carbohydrates all the time. Now, another model is also called the contemporary model, right? So the contemporary model is actually slightly more effective for performance, but it's not really maintainable over time. The reason that it's like that, let's say you typically use this as your last performance of the year. And the reason is if you're going through a season, you want to maintain training load in between your events. And if you're having days where you have no carbohydrates on training days, your training during that day is likely going to suffer, and therefore your adaptation over the season is not going to be as great. But the reason that the contemporary model is better for a single event is realistically what happens is during this period here where you're not having any carbohydrates, you are kind of burning through your leftover and last stores of your intramuscular glycogen. So this kind of creates somewhat of a starvation response, so that when you get these carbohydrates at the end here, this 10 to 12 kilograms, remember this is about 5 kilograms or 5 grams per kilogram. This is saying 10 to 12 grams per kilogram. When you have this, you get this massive stimulus and this massive release of insulin and a variety of other metabolic products that are going to store as much glycogen as possible. You can basically think of it as the idea is that your body's in a mode of starvation, and it goes, finally, here's food, here's our carbohydrates. We have to store as much as possible because we may never get any more of it again. And because of that, you get a slightly higher fraction of glycogen storage stored in the muscle than you would with the classical model, and therefore you get a slightly higher performance. But again, this would not be good over a long-term training period because you want to have carbohydrates in the day that you're training. And if you are trying to train those days, right, or if you're not training those days, you're not seeing any improvement. So the general idea here is typically, most of the time, you'll go with the classical model. The other problem with the contemporary model, as you can imagine, 10 to 12 grams per kilogram is a lot. For me, that means that I would be having close to 1,000 grams of carbohydrates in a single day, if not more, maybe like 1,200 or 1,300 grams of carbohydrates in a single day. If you're someone who tracks your food, you're thinking that is a lot of carbohydrates, right? I don't think most people even get close to 500 grams of carbohydrates per day, let alone double or triple that amount, right? So this can be also very hard on the GI system, hence why a lot of people don't opt for it. But again, like I said, generally a lot of review, just talking about our adaptations to training. Once again, if you feel like you've fallen behind, this is a good time to catch up because a lot of what we've been talking about is review. Otherwise, I hope you guys have a good rest of your day. And don't forget, there'll be another lecture posted shortly after this. All right, you guys have yourselves a good day.